Hi, I'm Ed Collier and I'm one of the co-directors of China Plate. And I'm also losing my voice, so apologies if I get really croaky. So China Plate, we call ourselves a non-building based theatre studio rather than producers, which is sort of quite an important semantic thing for us. Because we work across an ecology of interlinking partners and opportunities to make things happen. So there are three strands to what we do: making and touring, development and training, and showcasing and programming. And around those we work very closely with a small group of artists and a small group of venues, and very widely with a broad group of artists and a broad group of venues. So at the moment we're associate artists at the New Wolsey Theatre, who are also here somewhere. Sarah's here, spotted her from this. And at Warwick Arts Centre, where we're associate producers, and then do a lot of work with the NRTF, who are the National Rural Touring Forum as well. And artist-wise, we work very closely with Caroline Horton, Inspector Sands, Contender Charlie, but then we're making particular projects with people like Chris Thorpe and Rachel Chavkin, Action Hero, but it's a much bigger range of people, and that's sort of the heart of our business model, really, that we have a group of people that we're very loyal to and who are very loyal to us, but that's not where our range of opportunities begin and end. So we try to engage with as broad a range of people, from programming and touring through to making work and funding it as well. Over the last year, we've toured to somewhere like 20,000 people and programmed 2 festivals. We've had half a dozen, we've commissioned half a dozen different people, and we've probably had half a dozen commissions ourselves. And we run a number of development programs as well. We don't see ourselves either as commercial or subsidised, but it sort of happens to date that we've raised most of the money through a subsidised sort of funding model, which is really about us lining up ideas and artists behind venues and funding bodies and their priorities rather than individuals. So I think it's actually very similar. And it's really interesting earlier hearing about even 90% of the commercial work being made fails to make a profit for its investors. So for all of us, making theatre is involving somebody losing between a lot and a small amount of money most of the time. And the big question then for us is who, and therefore what agenda are those people that are going to be losing the money bringing to that relationship? And for us, again, really interesting to hear commercial perspective on that today, about feeling real freedom from having that with individuals. But actually I think with a lot of work that we do, we benefit greatly from having quite a close relationship with different funders and with the Arts Council over social agendas, and actually that helps to shape the work and empowers as much as it limits when it's successful. Sometimes it's a total pain, but it has really helped the development of a number of projects, particularly around, we do a lot of work inspired by science and academia, so a lot of ideas which have come from academic research, which we find a way of creating emotional engagement through story around in a theatre world which is about making theatre not showcasing the science. And that's probably my 3 minutes. If I could just say one very quick thing, which is slightly cheeky. Having sat down in the crowdfunders seat from the last panel, we're just embarking on our first crowdfunding. It is a complex minefield of conflicting opportunities. But if anybody felt like taking a look at Caroline Horton's Islands, there is an opportunity to get involved.
James.
Hello everyone, I'm James Seabright. I'm a commercial theatre producer based in London, and
and have been producing professionally since I graduated from university in 2001. More by accident than design, a lot of the shows that we produce begin life at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which was a producing model that emerged from my early explorations of putting shows on professionally, and has grown from there into a sort of marketing banner called Festival Highlights that my shows and other producers' shows collaborate on at the festival every year. And under that grouping, we've produced and managed and promoted about 200 shows since 2003. In terms of work outside of Edinburgh, we tour on the small, mid and #1 scales in the UK and further afield. We've particularly been getting into more international touring in the last 4 years, especially with Potted Potter, which is one of our longest running shows, a show that we found in Edinburgh and have developed commercially from there. But we have also got other international work going on. This autumn we're co-producing a season of the Best of the Edinburgh Festival in Toronto with the Merbishes, and we're working on an American tour of another of our shows for next year. In London, we produce on Fringe, off West End, on the West End. Most recently, we presented Julie Maddy Deeply and The Only Way is Downton at the Trafalgar Studios. Those are both shows that started in Edinburgh. We also transferred Eric and Little Ern to the Vaudeville Theatre, where it ran for 15 weeks on a sharing slot basis with some other shows that were there. So that's a sort of idea of our recent work. In terms of the business model and the way that our shows are funded, as I said, we are commercial producers, so we do, sometimes shows are funded through investment, sometimes shows are funded through existing company resources, particularly where we're starting a smaller show in Edinburgh, and it might be difficult to make that show make sense for investors at that point in its life. And we have occasionally applied for Arts Council funding and occasionally been given it. Most recently we had a development grant for the arts funding bids successful for Kerry Burnell's show, which was developed last summer and before touring around the UK. You know, I'm fascinated by the potential for redefining those boundaries and new ways of producing. A lot of our work in the West End has been developing ways of using West End theatres in ways that are more viable for smaller shows, so the family show model, if you like. And that's been a useful way of bringing shows like Potted Potter, Potted Panto into the West End market and running them with a ticket price that is accessible to a family audience. That's me.
Jenny. Hi there. I'm Jen Sutherland from Scamp Theatre. Scamp specialises in family-friendly touring theatre on the middle scale primarily. Much of our work does operate in the commercial sector in terms of that our income is derived from guarantees and box office income. However, that said, we do engage with the Arts Council occasionally through Grants for the Arts. Right now, we've got a variety of productions out, which are which are pretty good examples of the balance of our work and of our typical output. So if you excuse my notes. Firstly, we've got Pirate Gran. It's a new show for ages 3+. The production is on its initial UK tour at the moment. The development of this production was funded by Arts Council England, and our venue partner is the Watford Palace Theatre. We're also currently touring a remount of our production of Private Peaceful, which has been very successful over the years, by Michael Mopergo. And this is a co-pro. This particular production that we've got out at the moment is a co-pro with Fiery Angel, and it's on a #1 tour, playing alongside their production of Dial M for Murder rather. Also at the moment we are in the process of remounting Stickman by Julia Donaldson, another of our previous shows, and we're rehearsing in 2 casts, and that's going back into the West End this Christmas, and another production is going up to Edinburgh for Christmas. Out of these 3 current productions, Stickman and Private Peaceful are, I suppose, well, they are completely commercially sustainable, but their development, their initial R&D was funded by Grants for the Arts. And over the last few years, we've received funding on a project-by-project basis for the initial development of several productions like this. Usually, we apply for about 50% of the initial setup costs from Grants for the Arts. And all of our productions which have been funded like this have gone on to have sustainable, and I suppose I've got to use that word, commercial futures. I think that's all for me.
Mark?
I don't think I've got everybody. We have a fantastic ideas of people's mission of what they're doing, and I've never had a mission. I think I've always been more by accident, by design. I started working in the theatre at the Royal Court. I've also worked at the ICA. I worked with Bill Kenwright, or for Bill Kenwright, I think I should say. At the theatre, and I've been Marvin's to the imaginatively named company for well over 10 years. The projects that we're doing at the moment cross all kinds of things. So we booked and are general managing the UK tour of Warhorse on behalf of the National. I'm co-producing Jeeves and Worcester. We are supporting and managing Punch-Drunk's production of The Drowned Man. I'm going to forget something. We're managing the West End musical Once. There's a range of different things. We've done things like La Soirée in the car park behind the National and various other venues. There isn't a mission, there isn't a design. I've decided that, how do you measure what you do? How do you measure what you do? I'm never going to be the richest producer. I'm never going to be the one with the most awards. So I've decided the best producer is the one that's having most fun. Go out and do the shows that you want to do. And how you do them is more, I think and I've sat obviously in places that have been funded, and I've been sat in places which are strictly commercial, and the grass is always green on the other side. And you go, well, if I had funding, I could do this. If I had subsidy, or if I was in the commercial sector, I could do that. And I've sat slightly in the middle on the fence, because I acted as a producer for as a funder, really. There was an initiative called Made in Brighton to stimulate theatre production in Brighton, a town that is full of theatre practitioners, but actually produces very little from within Brighton. And so I sat a little bit in the funding model. And I think actually what's more interesting is probably where the money comes from is actually the least interesting thing is about the scale, and I think that probably has more impact on what you do. And I guess I tend to work, because I understand it better, the larger scale, and I admire people who work in a smaller scale where I go, but where does the numbers add up? How does that work? Because I don't understand it, but hats off to them, and that's me.
Hello, I'm Richard. I started producing in 1998, which is when I formed my production company. And I was very fortunate that I got a stage 1 bursary, one of the first ones to do that. Thank you very much. Before that I worked in stage management and in theatre management. When I produce shows, I suppose it sounds obvious, but I produce shows because I love the theatre and I got hooked on it as a kid, and I've never really been able to shake it off. My production company is called Richard Jordan Productions. It would have been called Richard Jordan Limited had it not been with a guy in Brighton who owned a garage who got there first. So I ended up rubbish garage. And he's not a very good theatre producer. But basically, my philosophy of work, I suppose, would be to say that I've always tried to keep my work as fluid as possible. And I think that's meant that I've been able to produce quite a range of different work. And that's what's always got me interested. I mean, I've always been interested in long runs, my career being one of them. And in that way, I think with developing relationships, particularly with writers and artists very early on, was something that was very important to me. Within my own company, how we operate, we produce in lots of different places in the UK and internationally. A lot of the work that I do is international collaboration. And I think that's also an important thing about producing. It isn't always just simply about writing the check. Producing is also about being a facilitator and joining companies or relationships that you build. It's all about relationships. And in that sense, theatres that you build around the world that can start to collaborate on a project, it's actually, the producer needs to be the person who engenders that. You discover art, you discover work, you discover companies, and then you come and say, how can I help you? How can we make that work and make that grow? within the way that we operate as a company, we use, I have a small core group of people who, when I set up, bravely came on board and helped me fund my company. And that's a little group that allows me to do a little bit of what I do. They get paid a little dividend if we've done quite well at the end of each year, and bravely they sometimes stick with me if we haven't done quite so well. And then out of that, we sometimes take in commercial investment if we're doing a larger show, or indeed sometimes we're working, like Mark, with general management and other aspects there, and indeed sometimes we're linking, and I work very regularly with the Subsidised Theatre on collaborating and co-producing shows. We're doing 2 productions at the minute with Theatre Royal Plymouth. We're doing another one with the Chicago Shakespeare Theatre and the Melbourne Festival, which is a project that we've commissioned and facilitated all together. And I produce kind of a range of shows, so I do things right from very emerging companies. Earlier this year I taught a show, because I like the play, called Bitch Boxer, which was with a young company called Snuffbox Theatre, which I found in Edinburgh, and we took that to Soho Theatre. We've done a little tour with that, and part of the interest there was that Charlotte, who's written that play, and Life in the Theatre is all about what you're doing next, and I was really interested in what that company would be doing next and building a relationship with them. And then right the way through to larger shows. Last year we did a play on Broadway which I was involved with a group of producers called Vanya, Sonia, Masha and Spike. And that thankfully did quite well and has allowed me to
That's an understatement, it won Tony, but...
so that's really what I've done. And in between site-specific work, I produce a company that Lynn can't pronounce the title of, called On Trut, which is a crazy bunch of Belgians, which I've now had a threesome with, which is a horrible thought. And that show we've done a lot in Edinburgh. That's led on to a program called Big in Belgium, which we did last year, the first edition of, which was, we galvanised 5 other Belgian companies after laying a little bit of a ground with Big in Belgium to start coming back. And we managed to get the Flemish government to support that, and they've come back to do that again with those companies also building within their own grants within Belgium. So that's kind of me.
Great. Now, I think we'll probably just open it straight up to the floor, because I'm sure people have got questions. So, let's start.
Oh, hi.
Yes.
My name's Anthony Green. I directed a fellow in Peckham last year. My question is, was there a moment when you went from producing Fringe to scaling it up, bigger venues, bigger budgets, and when that moment, this is for everyone.
I've never produced Fringe, so I'm definitely the one person.
Okay, I just wondered, at the moment I'm producing Fringe, but I'd love to come closer into town, reach more people, and I just wondered if any of you had any tips for that person who's there and going there.
James is probably an interesting person to start with that. One of the reasons I thought James would be brilliant today is that actually James is working across all those scales all the time.
I suppose for me, the first opportunity came when we were making some noise with a show in Edinburgh, and the phone rang, and it was the West End Theatre saying, "Would you like to transfer your show next month?" And that that doesn't happen very often. That's like that's the only time it's been quite that easy in the 12 years I've been doing Edinburgh. But it is often about my experience with my shows and seeing other people's work. I think it's often about when a show is created that has a potential bigger than an interest and engagement with the audience that's larger than the fringe beginnings of it will allow it to enjoy. So when a show is getting the great reviews and selling out and is being talked about, particularly in that kind of Edinburgh bubble, or it can be on London Fringe or elsewhere, that's a natural moment for a company or an artist or a producer to see how they can move that project to the next stage. And obviously, increasingly, there is a tendency for that to be a collaboration then with a partner who's got experience of the scale that you're moving into.
Yeah, because that's probably, it's a whole new set of, understanding what capitalisation is, understanding what units are, understanding, how to return investment.
Yeah.
How did you learn that?
I think, as Nick started calling, it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's experience, and it's probably actually doing it alongside other people. I'm a Stage 1 alumni, and I'm a Mark Rubenstein alumni, more importantly, and actually that the ability to share with other people, and actually the more partners you have with different areas of expertise, it's not possible for everybody for you to know everything.
Just one last question then. How do you approach? What's the best approach for approaching producing partners?
Richard?
It's like a marriage. I mean, a lot of producing is instinct. So one of the things I'd say most of all is be theatrically aware. I mean, it's like looking at someone whose work you might enjoy and say, I think I might find a synergy with that person. But you've just got to be very careful when you produce that you're not just producing out of blind love. You know, it's very easy to convince yourself of all sorts of things. Oh, this would be great, this would be great. And actually, if you're not sure about that relationship to begin with, then it's sometimes treading it, with a degree of caution. So it's trusting your instinct. But producing is a marriage and a collaboration. I mean, what we do is a collaborative art form. So, I mean, that's, it's a gut instinct within that, and understanding the roles of what all those people will play, and actually accepting them into a group. If you're a collective or a group or a company, you've got to understand that there's going to be a function there, and sometimes you have to make concessions, and sometimes that can enhance something, but if it doesn't feel quite right, then, that's the point, not necessary to continue.
I mean, I get a lot of emails of people saying, come see my show, would you do this? And people I don't know, and I'm crap, I don't read enough scripts, I don't respond to enough people, I don't see enough stuff, because there's a limit to how much you can do and there's a limited capacity, and so you shouldn't be put off if people aren't great. And the things I do go and see are usually because somebody's got my ear, is pushing. So there was a network, there's a really great network, and you're amongst the network right now, and use that, and don't be put off if the people you most want to see don't. Keep at it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of nurturing international work, international collaborations through production partnerships, either subsidized or commercial? Because some of you do that work and some don't, I guess.
Richard's the most. Yeah.
Okay, maybe it's easiest to use an example. If I use an example about Entrant Truth and a show called The Smile Off Your Face. And Smile Off Your Face is if any of you have seen it, those who haven't, it's a show that's a play about your senses. So it's kind of like a one-on-one experience. And it was up in Edinburgh in 2008, and or maybe earlier than that. And I was told I should go and see it. They'd done everything wrong to come to Edinburgh. They were only playing the first week. They sold their cast to come. They were a bunch of struggling poets, and they thought that Great Indian Theatre Company was a great way to meet girls. So that was basically the. And so I went down to. And so I sort of went down to see the show. I gate crashed it because they'd sold out. And at the end of it, we started a conversation about the show. I actually saw that show with someone I knew who ran the Adelaide Fringe at that point, and they had an award to give, and that award got the Smile Off Your Face to Australia. They carried on talking with me. I thought they sounded great, but they could be a bunch of lunatics, so if we were going to co-produce, we would do it together. So Adelaide happened. At that point, we were then invited to go to the Sydney Festival. The Sydney Festival, at that point, Kate Blanchett and Andrew Upton, who were running the Sydney Theatre Company, had heard this show. The show was a really great calling card show. It was never going to make a lot of money because only about 60 or 70 people a day can see that show. But what it could do was it could actually plant a company and a work that could get attention and profile. So Andrew Upton and Kate Blanchett saw that work and said, wow, this is really interesting. What are you doing next? And we said, well, actually, we're doing a show with some teenagers called Once and For All. We're going to tell you who we are, so shut up and listen. 13 teenagers doing a show about growing up, which we kicked off in Belgium and then in Edinburgh via the Travis Theatre. And then the following summer, we brought that to Sydney Theatre Company. And that went into their theatre, that did very well. And then they sat down and said, okay, what would you like to work with us on? And at that point, we were working on a show called A History of Everything. We were starting to scale up, partly because one of the things I knew when I got involved with that company, which had been doing a lot of smaller work, the director of it, Alexander Deviant, had very, very big ideas and ambitions, which were great, but they were also very expensive. So we needed to link with slightly more experienced theatre with Bills and stuff, which is Theatre Royal Plymouth, who I worked a lot with, who joined into that into the co-producing model. So we were now co-producing with them, which meant that when we came to suggest doing A History of Everything, Sydney Theatre Company loved the idea and said we'd like to do a 5-week run of it. But by that point, we'd started to do a bit of international touring because Smile had opened up the door for other shows to follow on the back of this company. So we were then able to bring in some other partners. So then that show we capitalised with Sydney Theatre Company, Sydney Festival, then I got City Theatre Amsterdam involved, Theatre Royal Plymouth, Chicago Shakespeare Theatre and Barrett in Belgium. All of them then came and put money in. It was a great setup for all of them. The Arts Council was pleased because it was giving some international profile through Theatre Royal Plymouth. It was fulfilling some of that agenda there that was going on through their support. But it also meant that all those theatres and those countries were getting coverage elsewhere. And that actually, just as an example, as a model, was a growth over a period of years that that's led on to that show, and that show still continues to be touring quite actively, and slowly we were able to upscale, because we can play up to 700, 800 people with that show.
It feels like it comes back to relationships, I think, that you're always building on one thing will always lead to another. And actually, your use of the word calling card was interesting, because in terms of that blended objectives thinking, actually, it might not be this show that has that might turn into something that can return a profit. But if you've got a great show, you should get it out there and get people to see it, because even if it's not that show, then you've got a relationship, so that then when the email lands on your desk and they say, come and see this show, you're like, oh yeah, that's people I saw the last show of. So it feels like constantly, any piece of work that you've got, get it out there as many different people.
Closer to home, that's the same model we did when we produced a play called Roadkill, which was all about sex trafficking. It was performed in a flat. We did that show, and then the next show that followed on was a collaboration that was a musical called Glasgow Girls, which we then developed with Theatre Hall Stratford East, who'd been brave enough to host that in London, and the National Theatre of Scotland. So that allowed a bigger growth for that show.
Next question. Up there. Oh, it's really hard to see that.
Hi, my name's Corinne Wahlberg. I'm currently a student at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama for creative producing, and I became a producer last year for a company called Portmanteau. And my question is kind of more asking advice, as we've gotten into Edinburgh, and from the very beginning of my experience here in London, everybody told me don't go. So I hesitantly said yes to the company that I would help them to get to Edinburgh. We got there, and now they want me there the entire month, and I thought, well, I'm the producer, what do I need to be there for the entire month for? So, since I'm spending a month in Edinburgh, what would be the best way to spend that time?
James has got enough shows that he could probably keep you busy pretty much. Mr. Seabright.
I did work out when the programme came out how many friends you'd have to have in order for you to see all of the Edinburgh Fringe programme, even if you were watching shows 24/7 without a break. I think this year it's something like 90 people will be required to watching shows continuously for a month without any sleep in order to get around all of the festivals. So that's one of the great challenges of the Fringe. I think it's important to balance what you're doing with your own work with seeing good stuff other people are doing, and that's often where new collaborations come from, because Edinburgh, as you say, a lot of the people doing shows are there for the whole month, trying to make a success of their show and also what their next thing will be. And it was probably one of my early mistakes when I was starting out to not get out and see enough other work, because it is, the answer to the question of what you'll be doing for the month will become obvious. Edinburgh will expand to fill the space available.
It's 24/7 as well, so there's no...
And I don't just mean in terms of the social aspect of it, the business side, and those two things do blend together more fiercely than anywhere else in the world, which is one way of justifying being up till 4 in the morning. No, but I think seeing other work is important, and actually taking the time to find out who's putting that work on, where that company's from, if there are collaborations for you that can work for you and your company from there. But it is also about thinking hard in advance and whilst you're there about how you can make the most of the opportunities for your show, because Edinburgh is a trade fair, and it's about making sure that you're making the right calls, contacting the right people, inviting the right people in. And sometimes the best moments can be those sorts of random occurrences like Richard was talking about, when you happen to see a show with someone and end up working with that person to take that show forward. And those happy accidents are very important parts of the Edinburgh ecology, and can also mean that even if you feel like the show hasn't been successful and you're in the last week, there can still be a chink of light will appear, in the last week, and there could be a future for the show that that wasn't obvious when you were flying in the rain week 1.
No question. Yes.
Hi, Catherine Webb from Seabright Productions. We've heard a little bit about how some of you got to where you are now, which is great, and also we've heard quite a bit about the commercial producers, obviously the Stage 1 programme that they can go through to gain the experience and get recognition. As a young producer of a very new and young company in the subsidised sector, Obviously, we can attend events like today. We can build up our network by going to see other people's events. We can go to the Edinburgh Fringe. But when we're putting on our shows as new companies, have you got any suggestions or pointers as to how we can get key industry players to attend our things to help us grow and help us develop when there is such a surge of new young producers coming through who all have work of their own, and like you say, you get inundated by requests all the time?
Do you know what it is you're wanting to do? Do you know where it is where you're wanting to go? When you say you're wanting people to come and see it, is there a particular path that you want your project to go?
Yes.
Or is it just...
Yes, you know, there are certain companies that, for example, I would aspire to be, you know, for example, you know,
nothing like flattery.
in 10 years' time, in 10 years' time, it would be wonderful for me to be sitting where Tristan Sharp sits, you know, the artistic director of Green Think Speak, you know, to be able to look back on his portfolio of work and be, if that was me, I'd be like, happy days.
Jen, you go first.
Play the long game. So think about that goal, and think about who it is that you need to meet to get to that point, and then who you need to meet to get to them. Keep going till you hit somebody you know. And don't be afraid to ask for advice. So try not to pester the people that you're trying to impress, but find yourself in a situation in which they might be of some tangible help, or you can buy them a coffee to ask them what you think about, what they think about what you should do. As often being the recipient of advice often becomes being the recipient of help and work.
I mean, Tristan, the Drinking Speak didn't get to where it was overnight. It's been going for a long time, and their projects have got bigger in scale and bigger in ambition, and which is great because not everybody does, and that, that's been rewarded with this. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I still go and ask for help and advice. And sometimes it's the kind of brand old people, and sometimes it's I'll phone Eleanor for advice as well. Don't feel afraid about getting that's a perfectly sensible, good thing to be doing, and it builds your network.
Jen.
I think you're absolutely right about flattery. It gets a very long way, and just asking somebody for 5 minutes of their time, a cup of coffee. And also, this goes back to the question from up there about Edinburgh. If you find yourself in Edinburgh, do hang out in this industry bars, meet people, regardless of their artistic background, make friends, and through them, certainly in such a small but large melting pot like Edinburgh, you can broaden your horizons hugely.
And I think thinking back to funding, it's kind of the same. That's about other producers and co-producer relationships. Funding is the same. I would imagine that our relationships with funders, whether they be private individuals, whether they be the Arts Council, whether they be trusts and foundations, whether they be other co-producing venues, it's always those keeping the conversation going constantly, having a reason to talk to people so that those relationships don't go cold. And often they start with a chance, you've been bugging someone for ages and then you happen to be in the same room with them and you grab them for 10 seconds and then that. Some of my investors, my private individual investors, come about through that kind of relationship. I might invite them to 5 things before we actually sit down and have a conversation about the next thing that I'd actually quite like them to invest in. Anybody else has no? Any more questions? It's got to be some questions.
Just as a slight follow-up to that last question, though, I think one of the important things when you're maybe approaching people who you don't know or don't have a kind of warm way of being introduced to, is to try and keep it brief. Like, I get a lot of emails introducing me to shows, introducing me to companies and inviting me to shows, and the heart does sink a bit when it's got 10 attachments and it's 6 megabytes and it's 3 pages of email body about exactly what they're doing. And obviously, I'm sure that all that information is valid and so forth, but it's not necessarily the best way to introduce yourself to someone who you're trying to get them to come and see the work. And actually, the old theatrical adage of leave them wanting more is a good one to bear in mind when sending those initial emails.
one thing I'd say, obviously, we were saying about the sharing of knowledge. If you share knowledge, it's the only way you get to keep it, and it's a really important thing, because we were saying Dream, Think, Speak, and all those artists where they are now. It's like knowing where they came from sometimes to get there, and understanding that journey that we all go on to put a show on, or run a company, or create work. I would say one thing that's really important about Edinburgh. It's just a little tip, but it's quite useful to go around with a small notebook. Because if you do go on and meet a lot of people, it's actually also, someone like Argo, I was talking to at the beginning of the day, to who I was speaking to in the evening. And so it's just having that track of those conversations. I mean, one of the smallest business cards I ever saw in Edinburgh was one where they gave you the card, and on the back of it, it said, "We met at." When they finished the conversation, they wrote it down. It's really valuable, and those relationships, so those relationships that you begin, and the synergy you find with people, it all comes out of those conversations. That investment in things doesn't happen on the first turn of a wheel. It's a long journey. If you're serious about your career, then it's an investment of time and energy to achieve it.
Can I also say, try and be clear about what you want from that individual or organisation. I think you might find it much easier to get a response if you come with some kind of proposal, big or small, because you're putting something on the table and you're asking somebody to think about it. And perhaps that could be more interesting to another individual or organisation rather than just can I meet.
Question here.
One observation I have from you is we haven't talked much about the audience and the punter, and I'd love to hear from each of you about that experience when the person invests so much in purchasing the ticket, making the decision, going for a night out, often at great cost. What do you think about the whole package, making it beyond a one-night stand?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, because it's probably very different for all of us. Ed, do you feel like your company has a relationship with the audience, as separate to the artist's relationship with the audience?
It's really difficult, that one, because we at Try and Play don't really need a relationship with the audience. But on the other hand, we are the audience when the work's being made. So we see our role in that process as representing the audience as a kind of the other half of what's going on the stage. So we try and anticipate things from story through to seating from an audience perspective as work's evolving, alongside thinking about suitability of partners and venues and how all that's going to work. So the audience is absolutely at the heart of everything we do, but actually the audience don't care who we are, which is completely fine, because the importance for the work that we're involved in is that the artist is the person who has the profile and who has the ownership over the work that's being made. But hopefully we have a love affair with the audience that they're unaware of.
How about you, Scamp? The audience has a relationship with Scamp? Or
I
just
hope
with the
so.
shows?
I hope so. Well, it's something that we're actively trying to develop at the moment through engaging with audiences, actually through questionnaires and websites, things like that. Our audience is very easily identifiable because we create work for children and young people, but the people who buy the tickets generally are parents, grandparents, teachers, so we're trying to attract them in various ways. So they might either buy tickets for the show because they know that their child watches this particular thing on TV, or they read the book, or indeed it's something they remember from their childhood. So we've got to pitch what we're producing. We try and do that right to that. But additionally, we're trying to create, I suppose, some kind of brand awareness of the name, because that means that we can start producing maybe more challenging work for our audiences. In the past, we've been lucky enough to produce a lot of work written by Malcolm McCargo and Julia Donaldson, which are huge rock and roll names for children. But just this year, we've produced a show by a relatively unknown author. And it's gone out in the middle scale, and it's done not too bad actually, but it's been a challenge. But we've had to engage with previous audiences in order to remind them what we've done in the past. So they'll come to this.
Mark?
I don't think anybody goes out to see a Mark Rubenstein show. I don't have somebody who's going to say.
Sorry, that wasn't the question that
No, but I think that
but are you showing the punters
with each show, does have a relationship with the audience, and they are different mostly show by show, and within each show, and most of what I'm doing runs long enough that probably 70% of my work is actually about marketing and about engaging with the existing audience and finding the new audience and the similar audience again. And that's something that I think we're forever learning how to do that, and it's developing and changing what works in a world in which people have such a multiplicity of choice about what to do, and it isn't cheap, and so it's got to be special, it's got to be unique, it's got to be something, and you've got to deliver for them, but you do have to have a relationship with them, but it's different from each show.
I think also, as a producer, it depends on the venue, relationship with the venue. Being the venue and not being the venue means you're playing a very different ball game.
Well, yeah, I was going to say on that particular point that the challenge often for a producer or as an artist going back to take a show out again is that the audience information, the data about your audience the first time around doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the venue.
Yes.
And the relationship, and actually that can make it complicated if you're then putting that show on in a competitive venue or that sort of thing. It can then be difficult to access that data and use it to remind your audience to enjoy the show the first time around that you're coming back. So I think one of the challenges there is finding ways to jump through that hoop by encouraging audiences to connect directly with the artist, and that's where things like social media can be very useful, very powerful ways of selling tickets, and I think that's often why shows which are individual artists, stand-up comedians for example, can often have a much happier kind of on sale, because that person has a profile and social media following that will generate immediate sales for putting a show on whatever the venue is. But it's also worth remembering that from the audience perspective, most of the time, they consider the show to be a function of the venue and more than the artist or the producer. And that's relevant in terms of a producer selecting the venue, but also just in terms of bearing that in mind. It's a huge thing that the quality of the experience isn't just about what's on stage, but it's about the venue as well and the overall experience of that night out. If the audience happen to have had a bad experience in a restaurant before coming to the show, that could actually completely change their appreciation of the show. That's even outside of the theatrical orbit. But I think thinking more about the audience experience in a wider sense is really important way of developing practice as a producer.
And it's a constant exchange as well with an audience. I mean, the last part of that exchange is the final point where you're in the theatre on the stage, and it's the exchange between the actor and the audience. And the last part of your play or your musical is the point where the audience themselves almost lift it up and drive it through to the curtain call. And in a way, that exchange continues the whole journey of when you first announce a show you're going to be doing it. And equally, I think, sometimes you're at the peril of where you are playing, as James and others have said, the drive of how that theatre represents itself is very important, because it could really come back on how your show sustains with that. But it is about, again, building that relationship and that connection. And I'm a great believer that the show does not begin when the person walks into the theatre. It begins considerably long time ahead of that.
We're going to have to stop actually, I'm afraid, otherwise I'll get in trouble for us being late again. Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause?